Greetings, everybody. So we're looking at the 6th chapter of our textbook right now, and has to do with kind of versions and supporting later APIs, what the values mean of target API, build API, minimum API. One thing, and this is the latest from Android's website, Google's website. About the current platform versions. Our textbook's is a well-written textbook and teaches the core parts of Android very well, but it is a couple of years old at this point, so this is one of the chapters where the data is a little out of date. So you can see these are the current percentages of versions. You can see most are on KitKat, Jelly Bean, API 16, 17, 18. It's like it's second. If you're willing to forgo about 8% of the market out there, you can go 4.0 and greater. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So this chapter in our textbook talks about a few things. It's a shorter one. That's why we're doing 2 chapters this week. But it deals with worrying about these SDKs. So if you remember when we're in Eclipse and we go to File, New, create a new Android application project. Right off the bat in this window, we're greeted with what's your minimum required SDK, what's your target SDK, and what's your compile with. So these are important settings. These two, minimum required SDK and target SDK, will set values in the manifest. And compile with is also the build SDK, and that is what determines this up here. What version of Android are we going to actually compile our code with? These two are notes to the Android operating system about should this app be installed on this device. It's also a heads up to the Play Store as to what devices will see that particular app when the user's browsing through the Play Store. So like if someone's on, say, a Gingerbread Android device and they're on the Play Store and your app has a minimum of ice cream sandwich, then your app shouldn't show up on the Play Store for that user. All right, so the minimum is the minimum that your app supports, right? So, and this has a lot to do with understanding this. The higher you set that, the more users you'll alienate. So that's a design decision when you're creating your app. Target SDK rule of thumb is to set this to the highest version. Right now mine has this API 21, which is a preview. I tend to set it to like the highest kind of established edition, right? So when I look out here, for me, that's 19, perhaps 21, but these are kind of very early adopters. In this class, we're using 19 as our target KitKat. So set that. Then compile with, once again, the rule of thumb for that is to set that to the highest possible version. The only exception, once again, is when these preview editions get released or where there's a new version that just got released. There might be some issues in there that are unresolved. You can change that build version. In Eclipse, I can right-click, say, this project and go to Properties. And if I go to Android, this is the build target. So right now, this is being built for 4.4.2. If I wanted to change it to, say, API 17, I could click on this checkbox, say Apply, and OK, and this would change. All right. So there are some issues with versioning. One of the ones that our textbook talks about, and it was a big deal when we went from, say, gingerbread to honeycomb, was the addition of the action bar. So let's go ahead and play around with that a little bit. I'm in our GeoQuiz project. I'm in our quiz activity class. And we'll work with the action bar a bit more in depth in a later class, but let's just add the ability to set the subtitle of the action bar in our code here. Now, before we start here, let's look at the manifest for this project. So remember how I said the minimum and the target are set in the manifest? So I've purposely set the minimum equal to 8 and the target equal to 19. In this class, we've been setting the minimum higher than this to avoid some things that the Android development kit does to support older versions that makes compiling on a lot of people's machines more difficult. But for the purposes of this example, I've set the minimum to a very early version, 8, which as we can see is only 0.4 of the Android population right now. But so for one, you can see the minimum and target. It's sitting there in the manifest file, right, about your app, and it's on this uses SDK element. All right, so let me go back to quiz activity, and I'll add some code. I'll say action bar, and we'll call our variable action bar, and I'll get action bar. This is a method of activity. All right, it gets me programmatic access to the action bar. The action bar on apps resides up here at the top. So, if I run, say, guess who here, this is the action bar. Okay, this is one of the apps from one of the students in our class actually. But this is the action bar up here. So this is a title. You could set a subtitle as well. So now I have programmatic access to that action bar, and I'll say action bar, and I'll set the subtitle. And I'll set it equal to bodies of water. So you might run into an issue where, save this. So you run into this issue right here, right? So this is a versioning issue. So the action bar wasn't available until API version 11. Now I've set this app to have a minimum SDK of 8. Okay, so last week or the week before, we started working with lint, right? And lint is picking this up as an error. All right, it's saying, hey, this call requires API level 11. You have a min of API 8, so that's going to be a problem. All right, so this is an example of versioning issues that can crop up. So one thing you can do is you can put conditional logic in there to work with that. So you do have this class called build and property version. And then I'll say dot, and I'll say, hey, what is the SDK in? So this is a property, a number of that API. And I'll say, hey, I only want to execute this code if it's equal to build dot, and then you do have this version codes, and then you have the API level for all of the different versions of Android. So if I say honeycomb here, it's basically 11. And I'll say, hey, only run this code if my current SDK is greater than or equal to honeycomb. So we have that set up. Now, the important thing to remember about this is that lint, so if I ran this code on, say, a version 8 version of Android, it would run okay. Okay, this is lint that's picking this up. There's no problem Java-wise with this code, but lint is still giving me a heads up saying, hey, this is API 11 code. So lint doesn't pay attention to this if statement. When we ran it on, say, a version 8 device, it would. But to get lint to be content, we're going to do this override. And I'll say at target API, and I'll say 11. All right. And I'll say the target API for this code is 11 or higher. That's a message to the compiler. That's what these ats are, messages to the compilers. And it's saying, hey, this is version 11 or higher. This code will still run on older devices. This is just a heads up to lint saying that this is version 11 or higher code. So by doing those two things with the if statements and the pre-compile directive, we've done a little bit of version checking and just starting to think about that as a good idea.